Hi guys, it's Miss Arneson, and I am here with a lesson about the hierarchy of living structures for Science 142, and this is regarding lesson number 4. So a question that you would see a lot of times on standardized exams, and it's because it's been in this, it's like a really important thing, so they've just been putting it in standardized exams forever, is put the following in order from least organized to most organized, and then they'd have a bunch of options, and students would get really confused on this question. Usually when you're working on a continuum, that means you're going to be going from like the most of something to the least of something. So, or one side of an issue to the other side. If we were thinking of politics, there would be like super, super liberal on one side, super, super conservative on the other side, and independent would be on the inside. So there's a whole bunch of spots where people could fit. Like you might be a Republican, but you're not super duper conservative. Or you might be an independent, but you lean liberal. So you have more democratic views that you think of than Republican views. So you could fit anywhere on that line. This is a continuum question, and it's saying, well, if you have the least organized on this side and the most organized on this side, where would we be putting things in between there? And the cool thing is when we're talking about the human body, we can actually think of this in terms of scale. So we're going to be going from the smallest to the largest in this case. So we're going to answer this question at the very end, but you might want to think right now about which of these would you consider to be the smallest and which one would you consider to be the largest. And if you would, just go ahead and jot those down in your notes real quick so that you can check and see if you're right in a second. So you might want to pause right now. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with the simplest thing. And in this case, on those options, the smallest thing would be DNA. And that seems crazy to me because you can think of DNA in a really big way also. So DNA is made of a bunch of atoms that are put together into what's called a macromolecule. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Don't worry, you'll never have to remember that whole name on a test. But you have about 2 meters of DNA in every cell in your body. So like if we stretched it out, it would be 2 meters long. Although you wouldn't be able to see it because it's so small that like you could stretch it out, but you wouldn't be able to tell that it was there. It would be an invisible line. What that means though, is that even though DNA is so small you can't see it, it's also trickily big, like it's kind of big too, because if we took all 30 trillion of your cells and we lined those up and we stretched out that DNA, then that DNA could basically go across the solar system twice. And so that's like really huge, but it's microscopically small. So that's why we're going to say it's the least organized. Why would it be the least organized? It has to be really organized, right, to carry genes? Yeah, but when you have those genes and they're not in a living thing, the DNA doesn't do anything. So that's why it's the least complicated and the smallest in this case. Then we get a little more complicated. DNA is inside of the nucleus, right? In eukaryotic cells, or it's inside of a cell in a prokaryotic cell. So we know that DNA has to be smaller or less organized than cells for sure. But since organelles are even smaller than cells, we have to have this step in between, which is organelles. Organelles know how to do their job from the DNA, so you wouldn't even be able to build organelles without the DNA's information. So organelles are a little more complicated than DNA because they take DNA and they do something with it. They get a little bit more complicated because now they're doing specialized jobs based on the directions in the DNA. Let's go to the next level. Just a little bit more complicated. So here I have 3 examples of cells. There is an animal cell that's generalized, a plant cell that's generalized, and then also a prokaryotic cell. Notice it doesn't have a nucleus, but it still has organelles. It has a cell wall, a plasma membrane, just like all cells have a plasma membrane. It does contain DNA, and it of course has ribosomes, which all living things basically have ribosomes because they build proteins, which is a really huge deal in life. So This is a basic unit of life. And what you do in order to get to this level of complexity is you put a whole bunch of organelles together and you get something more complicated. So that's why it's the next step, and it's also the next in size. Although I will note that some plant cells are way bigger than some prokaryotic cells, and so you might have the nucleus of one cell being larger than a prokaryote, so there are exceptions always to the rule. Now, there's something called cell theory we went over earlier, and I'm going to come back to it at the end, but I just want you to remember that cell theory says all living things are made of cells, all cells come from existing cells, and cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living organisms. And that last one is the most complicated. But we are going to look at how those cells, how that basic unit of structure and function is analogous to a human body itself later on. So when we get bigger than a cell, when we put a bunch of cells together, we get what's called a tissue. And the definition I want you to write in your notes for tissue is a group of cells that have a similar structure and that function together. So if you look at these 3 or 4 examples of types of tissue in the human body, you'll see that even though these have some variation in their shape, they still look very much alike. Same, there's some variation in the shape, they look alike. And all of these cells would be working together on the same thing. This is a way more specialized than just looking at a generalized cell. And that's why it has a little more complexity. Because instead of an organism that just has one cell, and so it's unicellular and it just does its thing, now we have to have a bunch of cells in a multicellular organism that are working together to do something within the larger organism itself. After tissue, we're going to get to, even more complex, an organ. And here's the definition to write down for organ. A group of tissues performing a function. So here we don't just have one type of tissue. We're going to have several different types. We're going to have muscle, we're going to have fat, and these things are working together to get blood pumped through the body. That's their purpose, and they all have to work together to do that. It's complex because instead of just having one tissue doing one job, we have a bunch of tissues together that are trying to make some function occur. Okay, next we get to an organ system. This organ system that's being shown in the picture is the circulatory system. Basically, how your heart is pumping all of your blood to different parts of your body so that, you can have oxygen and have cells function correctly. The definition of an organ system is several organs working on the same function. Here the function would be providing all of the body parts with oxygen. So this is even more complex because instead of just having one organ, we're going to have at least 2 always involved. Okay, I googled human and this is what came up. Doesn't that weird you out? Don't trust the internet. You guys, you Google something and I don't even know. So I picked a human. Oh dang, is it going to come up? Okay, yeah. So I picked a human representation that's supposed to be one of the most beautiful things of all time. It's Michelangelo's Adam, and an organism, in this case a human organism, is multicellular, and it also has a bunch of organ systems that are all working together to make the human work. So if we took a step back and we just had the circulatory system, well, if we only had blood and blood veins and a heart, we still wouldn't be able to function. And so this is the most complex. But there is an exception to the rule because they're always, oh no, just kidding. Let's do the answer first and then we'll do the exception. So this is the real answer to the question that we started off with. DNA would be the least complicated, going to organelles, because those are the next big, and they are more complicated, to cells, to tissues. Oh, I forgot organs. You guys look, organs goes right there. Organ systems, and then organisms. And here's just a diagram that basically shows you that, but it goes even smaller to looking at molecules and atoms. Believe it or not, we could go even smaller than that. Here's our exception to the rule. What if you have an organism that is unicellular? It's just one cell. Well, then we would stop right here at cell for our highest level of organization. Some examples include all of the bacteria on Earth. They are unicellular and they are prokaryotes. So their organization would go DNA, organelle, but none of theirs are membrane bound, and up to a cell. There's also amoebas. You know the amoeba sisters. This is what an amoeba actually looks like under a microscope. I have never seen one and I am disappointed. I want to see one. They're really cool. And then we have some algae and some unicellular funguses and protists. Not all protists are actually unicellular, but in this picture they're saying they are. And then there's also a whole other group of organisms called the archaea, and they're all unicellular too. How does this connect to the cells theory? So remember I told you to pay attention to cells. Okay, well, this is a unicellular organism. It's an amoeba, another picture of an amoeba, and it's going to chow down on this food. It gets these what are called pseudopods, which are like, it kind of makes its membrane into these little legs that surround its food, and then it makes it into a little membrane-bound packet, and then it sends in some enzymes and digests that food up. Okay, well, the first two parts of cell theory, all things are made of cells, and cells come from existing cells, like, okay, those are easy, right? But cells are the basic unit of structure and function in organisms. Here's what you should write down so that you can remember what this really means. One cell kind of acts the same way as something as complex as a human body. Because cells have little parts called organelles, bodies have little parts called organs, and those organelles work together to make the cell form and function just like they do for the human. So here's what I'm guessing is the nucleus of this amoeba, and the nucleus acts kind of like the brain of the human being. The outside part of it would be the membrane, right? And for us, that would be our skin. So we have all these parts that do specific jobs, even though they're made of trillions of cells instead of just one. So that's what that means. We're the basic unit of structure and function in organisms. This is a lot like this whole human, except for this involves a lot more cells. So I just wanted to make sure you guys know that, because that's something that I've seen throw students off a lot of times. Talk to you later.